So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining New Jersey Audubon's webinar on healthy forests. I'm Eileen Murphy. I'm Vice President of Government Relations at New Jersey Audubon. Welcome. Before introducing our guests, I want to take a moment just to go over some of the webinar features. You've all done webinars, you pretty much are familiar, but I like to go over them again just in case. You'll notice there's a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and that's where I'll ask you to post your questions as you think of them. We won't be taking questions immediately after each presenter. They'll be addressed at the end of the webinar. And Drew Tompkins, who is New Jersey Audubon's Policy Director. Drew, just give a little hand wave and say hello.
Everybody.
He'll be scanning the Q&A throughout the webinar and putting similar questions together. Also, if your question, say, for the first panelist has been answered by a subsequent speaker, we're going to make a note of that as well. If you think your question has not been answered, just put it in the Q&A again. We're going to make every effort to address all the questions that are coming in. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and that way colleagues who cannot attend in person can still listen in at another time. And I want to take a minute to plug another two webinars that we will be sponsoring. The next two will be specific to New Jersey forest health, climate change, and carbon sequestration by forests. The first is scheduled for August 4 at 11, and the second will be in September. We're in the process of finalizing our panelists, but I sure hope that you can all join us for those two subsequent webinars. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. Amanda Mahaffey. She is the Deputy Director of the Forest Stewards Guild, and in her role as Deputy Director, she builds on 7 years serving as the Forest Steward Guild's Northeastern Regional Director. She is herself a licensed forester and holds degrees from Yale University and the University of Southern Maine. She's been an active member of the Forest Stewards Guild and the Society of American Foresters since her student days, and is very passionate about supporting succeeding generations of forest stewards. Among her many accomplishments are the expansion of the Foresters for the Birds program, which is an innovative project that helps landowners integrate songbird habitat into forest management practices. She's also involved in the development of learning events for the North Atlantic Fire Exchange, the growth of New England's forest climate adaptation community of practice, where she partners with scientists and managers to discuss emerging topics related to the effects of climate change on forest management. And she supports Guild members in general in advancing ecological forestry. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us. Next up, Jeffrey Larkin. He is a professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And he is the Forest Birds Habitat Coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy. He received his bachelor's in biology from Ithaca College and his master's in forestry and PhD in animal sciences from the University of Kentucky. His research combines his expertise in forestry, wildlife ecology, and conservation implementation. And his research findings are often synthesized into applied information used by natural resource agencies to enhance or develop management guidelines. In 2012, Jeff began serving as the Forest Birds Habitat Coordinator, and in this function, he directs a team of conservation planners and foresters who assist the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service with the delivery of private lands conservation programs that target forest wildlife, including gold-winged warblers, American woodcock, cerulean warblers throughout the Appalachian and Great Lakes states. His position with American Bird Conservancy also enables him to serve as the science advisory for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation's Working Lands for Wildlife program. Thank you, Jeff, for agreeing to be a panelist. And then we also have Douglas Tallamy, who is a professor of entomology and wildlife at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 80, or maybe more than that now, research articles. And
104.
104, boy, I was out of date. And has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses for 32 years. He
40.
Back, oh, 40. I am out of date in my bio. Thank you, Doug. I hope the rest is up to date. Well, here's some history. This has to be. He has a bachelor's in biology from Allegheny College, a master's in entomology from Rutgers, go Scarlet Knights, and a PhD in entomology from the University of Maryland, followed by a postdoc fellow in entomology from the University of Iowa. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways that insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. His subsequent books, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, Beauty and the Beast, and most recently in 2021, The Nature of Oaks, are required reading for anyone interested in the topic of healthy forest ecosystems. Among his awards are the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation, the Tim Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence, the B.Y. Morrison Communication Award, and many others. So thank you, Doug, for joining us today as well. And thank you, Drew, for coordinating the Q&A. With that, I will be quiet so that we can hear about forest ecology and healthy forests in New Jersey, starting with Amanda. Thank you, Amanda.
All right, thanks. Let me make sure that this is working. Someone please confirm that you can see my presentation.
I can see it.
Okay. And for some reason, I can't see my cheat sheet notes. There they are. Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks so much for having me today. Eileen asked me to speak about the topic that ecological forestry is forest stewardship. I grew up in northern New Jersey and I learned to love trees, and I eventually went to forestry school and became a forester. While my work today with the Forest Stewards Guild spans the Northeast and other forested regions of the US, I'm really excited by the opportunity to bring these skills home, even remotely, to the place where I grew up. My presentation just consists of 7 take-home points with a few little stories thrown in. So, first take-home point for all of you. Ecological forestry is forest stewardship. If you're not familiar with the term forestry, it's the art and the science of forest management. You might also hear that term silviculture, which you can see here with the tenets of silviculture from Brian Palick et al. Silviculture is really about the cultivation of trees. And as Doug said when we were preparing for this session, we're all tending the forest garden. A forester is a person who has an education and training in the field of silviculture and related fields, who makes decisions about the forest, including writing plans and prescriptions, kind of like a doctor for the forest, if you will. A logger, on the other hand, is a person who really runs the harvesting equipment and actually cuts the trees, usually with a chainsaw or much more complicated equipment these days. But a logger is not necessarily trained in forestry. A little bit briefly about my organization. The Forest Stewards Guild practices and promotes responsible forestry as a means of sustaining the integrity of the forest ecosystem and the human communities that depend upon it. We envision ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry as the standard for professional forest management from coast to coast. A few of our points are really, our mission and values are really tied into today's theme, and that's why I'm talking a little bit more about my organization. One of our key points is that the forest has value in its own right, independent of human intentions and needs. And another key tenet is that the natural forest provides a model for sustainable forest resource management. Therefore, responsible forest management imitates nature's dynamic processes and minimizes impacts when harvesting trees or other products. The problem is that a lot of nature's natural processes have been disrupted, which we're going to talk about. The photo that you see here is from the New Jersey Pine Barrens on a property managed by forester and guild member Bob Williams. Bob used mechanical treatments and prescribed fire to restore the ecosystem function in this fire-adapted pitch pine scrub oak ecosystem, which enhances habitat for bobwhite quail, among many other species. Humans are part of the ecosystem. Next little part is kind of a fast forward through some forest history in New Jersey and how our landscape was shaped. Since time immemorial, the Lenape have belonged to the forest that we discussed today in the lands of New Jersey. European settlers cleared the land in the 1700s, and the forests that have regrown in the last hundreds of years are not the same as the forests that were cleared in the 1700s. Of course, the 1800s brought the growth of cities and the rise of the industrial era. Sadly, even though I'm from New Jersey, but we hear the, being called the armpit of America. Not true, not true. We're also the garden state, but we can see the legacy of that on our landscape in areas that were formerly forested. New Jersey actually had a viable forest products industry well into the 1950s. However, by the time of the Farmland Assessment Act of 1963, we were losing 50,000 to 60,000 acres per year to development. With this increase in forest fragmentation and a decline in active forest management, New Jersey's forests are getting older. In 1999, the average age was between 41 and 60 years, but by 2013, the average age of New Jersey's forests was between 61 and 80 years. So our forests are getting older on average. And like our aging human communities, forests need care. While 80 might be sort of middle-aged for a tree, it's still an important time in life to be considering options and planning for the future. If you want to be strong and well supported in your late successional and old growth stages, it really takes thoughtful planning and action in your earlier years. This photo here is taken in Mills Reservation in northern New Jersey. This forest abuts a reservoir that serves Greater Newark. Forest stewardship is needed here, as everywhere, to protect the water resource. This forest sees heavy recreation, which compacts soils and can create runoff loaded with sediment. People walk dogs here and do not always pick up after them, not something you want in a water supply. And we'll talk about some of the larger threats to forest health in our next slide. Forests are dynamic. However, the current pace of change has really thrown the ecosystem out of balance. Deer. I mentioned I grew up in northern New Jersey. When I was a kid, we did not see deer, hardly ever. Now you see them kind of every day, and they have a major impact on our forests. High densities of deer can eliminate the native shrub layer and in turn reduce breeding habitat for many bird species. Invasive plants. Common problematic species, you might be familiar with some of these, tree of heaven, garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, Asiatic bittersweet, spotted knapweed, autumn olive, Japanese knotweed, Phragmites, multiflora rose. Unfortunately, these invasive plants have become all too familiar in New Jersey's forests today. And it's a problem because invasive plants outcompete native herbaceous plants and shrubs, preventing the natural forest from regenerating as it had been. Forest pests and pathogens. The New Jersey Forest Action Plan lists gypsy moth and sudden oak death as pathogen problems, and pests include Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, southern pine beetle, hemlock woolly adelgid, and it also lists deer among its most damaging agents. According to the New Jersey Forest Story Map, mortality increased by 35% from 2010 to 2015, which I recognize includes time when Hurricane Sandy impacted our forest landscape. I'll get to that in a moment. Climate impacts, you can see here, sugar maple, white ash, black cherry are among those species that are predicted to decline with climate change. The warming climate and increased carbon dioxide gives invasive plants an advantage. As you can see, every spring, they're usually the first plants to green up and they're the last to die. Trees are more stressed by heavier rain events, hotter heat, and drier soils. So Hurricane Sandy. Hard to not think about Hurricane Sandy. As you can see in this photo, Maya Lin's Ghost Forest exhibit in Madison Square Park in New York City viscerally shows the impacts of climate change on forests. New Jersey's Atlantic white cedar are a globally threatened and critically imperiled forest ecosystem, and the saltwater inundation caused by Hurricane Sandy really devastated whole stands of Atlantic white cedar. So on a brighter note, forests thrive on diversity. That's how we can help overcome these challenges. A diversity of tree species means that some may be climate winners, even though there are some of those climate losers on that race to survive the changing climate. A diversity of understory plants, including regenerating or young forests, can illustrate nutritious soils and healthy hydrologic dynamics. A diversity of wildlife, especially birds, can tell you a lot about how the forest can be benefited by thoughtful forest stewardship. A diversity of insects, especially caterpillars, provides the equivalent of a farmer's market or a Whole Foods to native wildlife. Forest structure. Vertical forest structure includes a healthy overstory canopy, a thriving midstory that's on its way to becoming the future canopy, and a dense understory of tree seedlings in a healthy forest. with diverse vertical structure. Also, across the landscape, the natural forest includes a shifting mosaic of openings, different sized canopy gaps that let in sunlight to the forest floor. It can also include thin stems and also areas with later successional characteristics. And again, the forest is dynamic. What it looked like once upon a time is not necessarily what it should look like today or 40 years from now. The forest is always growing and changing. These types of diversity support the forest ecosystem's function. All of these parts are working together to keep a forest vibrant and healthy. I will add that forests also can thrive when there is a diversity in the people that steward them. The photo here shows a workshop in Pennsylvania for women woodland owners. And as we said, humans are part of the forest ecosystem. My next take-home point for you: well-managed forests are resilient forests. Given all the threats that we discussed, leaving forests alone just doesn't cut it. Forest management today must include climate adaptation for tomorrow. The photo here is borrowed it's a picture from Steve Kolesser, who's a forester with Gracie and Harrigan Forestry Consultants in northern New Jersey. And it shows him and his future forest assistant, who's probably a little taller now, surveying oak regeneration on a private forest in Sussex County. In this example, Steve used tools developed by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science to create an adaptation plan focused on promoting oak regeneration. The timber harvest on this property was planned to improve light conditions on the forest floor while retaining some hard mast sources, so oak acorns. You have those years when the acorns just roll around all over the streets. We want that because it helps ensure that there's more oak regeneration, the little seedlings you can see in the picture here. The plan also included creating some early successional openings that were large enough to benefit golden wing warbler. It also included trying to spray for gypsy moth and monitoring for invasive plants, which fortunately there were not a lot of on this property at the time of the plan, and continuing aggressive deer control. You would not see this much oak regeneration in a forest that did not have deer populations well controlled. Just an added benefit that I will not go into in detail is that healthy forests have a co-benefit of being good at storing carbon. I understand there will be a whole webinar on the topic of carbon in forests later. So just a little preview for you here. Here in the photo, this is a managed watershed in a coastal Massachusetts area that sees active timber harvesting that keeps the forested watershed resilient in case of catastrophic natural disaster. We're actually looking right up one of the haul roads in this picture. So my last point for you is that responsible management that sustains the forest requires a humble approach and continuous learning. We don't know everything there is to know about trees, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to learn with me today. I think that we can all agree that we owe it to the next generation to leave these forests better than we found them. The photo here in the middle was taken about 40 years ago. And the next photo was taken this May of 2021 on the first birthday of that kiddo with the crazy hair. And the photo at right shows the New Jersey that this little kid and millions of other new people call home. So with that, these are my summary points, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I love those pictures at the end. Thank you for sharing. Okay, with that, we will spin it off to Jeff Larkin.
It's Doug's turn.
I think I'm going next.
Okay, I'm sorry, Doug.
Yeah, all right. Good. Okay. Oops. All right. I want to talk about managing forests for biodiversity. Of course, there are options in managing forests. There's an awful lot of people around the country that think we manage forests for one reason, and that is board feet. How can we get products out of the forest? And we certainly do that. But today we're talking about managing the forest to increase the number of species that those forests support. Why do we need to do that more today than ever before? Because we've got a biodiversity crisis on this planet. You've seen these headlines. We've got the insect apocalypse here now. We've got global insect decline. And remember, insects are the little things that run the world. Without them, we would not be here. North America's already lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. Just about a third of our breeding bird population already gone. UN feels that or predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, maybe in the next 20 years. as if that's an option. It is not, by the way. We're already in the 6th great extinction. The World Wildlife Fund says that we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth. These are not tolerable conditions. We've got to turn that around. And managing our forests for biodiversity is going to be a major way that we can turn these grim statistics around. Now, there are 4 well-known major threats to forest biodiversity. Amanda just went over all of them, I guess. Forest fragmentation certainly is a big one. The more we chop up our forests, the more we expose them to edge effects, the more we make them not forests anymore. They become little teeny forest fragments, which are not functioning as they did when they were all connected. So fragmentation, huge issue. The loss of diversity, both in tree species and in tree age, is a major factor in the loss of biodiversity within forests. We want a diversity of ages, from the small right up to the old giants in every forest. And in so many forests, we've lost that. Invasive species, invasive insects, invasive plants, invasive diseases. I mean, think what our forests looked like before the chestnut blight came and changed them dramatically, certainly throughout the last 100 years, our lifetimes as well. And that's a single disease. And then we've got diseases coming in all the time. So Amanda talked about that as well. But invasive species, very serious problem to forest management. And then the overabundance of deer, which actually is an interaction with invasive species. Many of the plants that are invading our forests are invading the forest because deer eat the natives and not them. So it tips the competitive balance against our native plants. Tom Rubinski recently said that a bigger threat to eastern woodland, that overabundance of deer is a bigger threat to eastern woodlands than climate change. So that puts it in perspective. Too many deer, not good. I'm going to talk about a 5th threat to forest biodiversity that has not gotten much attention lately. And it's a direct result of research that we've done at the University of Delaware. And that's the loss of keystone plants. In order to sustain food webs, we have learned that you need caterpillars. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms, particularly vertebrates, than any other type of plant eater. So if you don't have a lot of caterpillars in your system, most of the energy that the plant generates from the sun, turns into food, is then locked up in its tissues, but it stays there. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates that eat those plants, and most of those invertebrates are caterpillars. You can think of birds. Birds take thousands of caterpillars just to make one clutch. So having caterpillars is essential. And it's not essential just for a few birds. It's common throughout our terrestrial birds. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. I know that from several different sources, but this is a citizen science project that a recent grad student did for me, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. They were going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that were in the beaks of those birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many bird species as she could in the country. So here's a summary of her results. It's the nestling diet reconstructed for 20 of the common bird families in North America. And in 16 out of 20 of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. The green bars are the percentage of caterpillars in those diets. So imagine what would happen if we design landscapes or forests that do not have enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. We also went to Rosenberg et al.'s original data. They're the group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the bird species, this is North America, of course, into 2 groups: the birds that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the birds that do not require insects. So the finches and doves that can actually reproduce off of seeds. They didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as insects decline, so do the birds that require them. And that's not rocket science. If you take away the bird food, you're not gonna help the birds. So let's simplify it. How do we manage forests for caterpillars? This is where the concept of keystone plants comes in. We have found that just a few native plants are making most of the caterpillar food. Let me remind you what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. if you recall from the old days, and the keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. So if you take keystone plants out of our local food webs, the food web collapses. And that's because just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of that caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food. So that means, 85, 86% of our plants, our native plants, are contributing, but not all that much. So think of the keystone plants in the ecosystem, the forest that you're managing, as the 2x4s that are holding up the food web. They're essential to holding up that food web, which means, they're not optional. You have to have them. They don't comprise the entire food web. So your ecological house here is not done when you have keystone plants, but they've got to be part of it. And that's the concept that is new in terms of forest management. We haven't thought about which plants are the most important in the past. So forests are poor in keystone plants are going to be poor in animal diversity. The best keystone plant in the mid-Atlantic states, so that certainly includes Jersey, is oaks, genus Quercus. We've got 91 species of oaks in this country, and in 84% of the counties in which oaks occur, they're the #1 keystone plant. Mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. That's 557 species of bird food, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How does that compare to other common trees we have in our forests? Well, in the deciduous forests, tulip tree is very common. They only support 21 species. So it's not that tulip trees are bad, they're just not as productive. So if you have a tulip monoculture, that's something that can be managed for increased productivity. Unfortunately, the percentage of oaks in our eastern forests is half of what it was a century ago. So again, this is where forest management can help manage in a way that increases the keystone plants that are producing most of the food. How do we find out what the keystone plants are around the country? You can go to the Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most productive plant genera in terms of supporting caterpillars will pop up for your county. So here are the woody plants, and here are the herbaceous plants. A lot of people don't think herbaceous plants are important in terms of making caterpillars, but goldenrod support 110 species of caterpillars. They're also critically important in terms of being keystone plants for specialist pollinators. When we're trying to support the pollinators that allow our flowering plants to reproduce, you have to plant for specialists, because the generalist pollinators can use the plants that the specialists use as well. But if you plant just for generalists, just things that honeybees and bumblebees like, the specialists can't use them. So these three genera right here are the top genera in terms of supporting specialist bees in the New Jersey area. They alone will support over 44 species of specialist bees. Landscapes without them will be missing those bees. So proper forest management must include management for keystone plants. That's all I have. Thank you.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Who knew caterpillars were so important? You did.
We did.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll hear from Jeff Larkin. Thank you.
Hey, Jeff, we can't see you or hear you.
There you are.
Yep. Sorry about that.
But we did see your presentation when you were sharing it.
We'll go there now. Should be good, correct?
Right.
Yes.
You go into presentation mode.
Yeah. With a little bit of a lag here for some reason. Are we good now?
Yes.
Bingo.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Amanda and Doug. It's great to be presenting with you both today. Appreciate your insights, and I think I'll be able to provide a little bit more insight and to talk a little bit about the importance of stewardship in managing public lands. And hopefully by the end of my presentation, we'll have covered, really all three of us will have covered all of the topics that will provide a nice opportunity and foundation for us to have some conversation afterward with many of the questions that folks may have. So happy to be here. Well, New Jersey is like a lot of our other mid-Atlantic states. You know, we don't necessarily appreciate the amount of forest we have until we start to tally the number of acres that occupy our landscapes by forests. And in New Jersey, it's 42%. And yeah, who would think the typical person across the U.S., if you would ask them how much forest was in New Jersey, would say 42%. It's not only a significant component of your landscape, but it's also therefore a significant responsibility of managing and being stewards of those forests. It's a significant part of your state's economy, whether it be extractive or more recreational. And of course, as Amanda pointed out, a lot of you have a connection from a natural heritage perspective. Forests are something that you've been around, and forests are something that we can all be passionate about, and extremely passionate in some cases, and have our opinions. I'm from the Adirondack Mountains of northern New York, and I'm very fortunate to have grown up there and to have been surrounded by rich biodiversity and beautiful forests while I was a youth. And New Jersey's forests are diverse. Doug just recently in his talk just touched on the diversity of our forests, and certainly we could have entire journals attributed to this, and have been, and seminars could be the focus of this subject of diversity. But sadly, we also know that we can also have much conversation on the threats to that biodiversity. And I'm showing biodiversity from a species level here, right in the top right corner, but we can think about that being at a genetic and a community level perspective as well. I'm not going to go into it because Amanda and Doug provided a nice overview of those threats. We might touch the private land component of unsustainable timber harvest that occurs when foresters are not involved with decision making and planning. But the others have been well covered here: invasive species and deer. No matter your opinion on what we should do with our forests as stewards, one thing I think we can agree on, and that is that we need to keep forests on the landscape. Number one step of having healthy, diverse forests is to actually keep forests on the landscape. But that's not enough, though, in and of itself. We have to be thinking about step two. And, you know, there are many organizations, many individuals, many groups that are wonderful at step one, keeping forests on the landscape, adding more forests to the landscape through protection and easements. But unfortunately, many of those same entities, usually due to lack of resources to do the work that needs to be done, are not very good stewards of their forests. Stewardship, as was indicated in the flyer associated with this webinar, is the responsible planning, care, management of natural resources that considers the interests of society, future generations, and species. Notice planning, caring, and managing. Those are active words. And stewardship can take the look of many different flavors, if you will. Such as this, low shade removal in a forest for which accelerated old growth conditions will be the focus. It may look like this, a regeneration harvest, but that really limited and quite valuable early successional forest on the landscape. It might be prescribed fire. This looks like a beautiful, mature, lush forest, but forest ecologists and foresters know that this image here is a sign of overabundant, or let's say deer populations that are out of balance with local landscapes. In this field of hay-scented fern, needs to be dealt with if we're going to care about the resiliency of the forests that are overhead. And stewardship in that way may look ugly for a bit, such as this herbicide application. But the reality is, when that fern herbicide application results in many oak seedlings on the forest floor, those oak seedlings that Doug just mentioned are so important to so many of the insects that form the foundation of our food webs.
Jeff, let me interrupt for 1 second. It sounds like you have paper or something over your microphone. So just that away so we can hear your words a little bit better. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why that is, but we'll see. How about now if I speak louder?
Yeah, that's much better. I don't know what you
did.
Okay,
I'm virtually yelling, but that's okay. There's nobody in my office right now, so I'll talk loud. So I'd like us to think about stewardship and what stewardship really focuses on. And I'd put it into 3 categories. I would say it's the ghosts of forests past. We remember the landscape scale clearing of the forests of long ago, like the image here on the top. And that resulted in forest in many landscapes, right? But much of that forest is of the same age, the same flavor of forest across vast areas resulting from past actions. We can think of these as the ghosts of forest present, such as deer and high grading, and choose the invasive species or disease, if you will, of the day, of the month, of the year. And then, of course, we need to be doing stewardship to prepare for ghosts of forest future. And we can only imagine what that might be. But we have learned over the last 50, 60 years, 100 years, that your imagination probably will not be too far off. One group of species that have really been taking it on the nose, and Doug alluded to this, with the 3 billion birds lost over the last 50 years, are forest birds. And one thing that we also can guarantee is that there have been a lot of people that have studied forest birds, and they've studied forest birds from a habitat relationship. And one thing that's clear from the volumes and volumes and volumes of journal articles that have been prepared on this subject is that forest birds have an intimate relationship with landscape context, as well as the structural complexity of vegetation. And within that structural complexity of vegetation, we can think about species composition as well. Some work from some of my own graduate students and collaborators have shown that forest birds are in trouble. We say, wow, there's lots of forests on the landscape. Why is that? Well, when we start to think about the needs of forest birds during the entire avian reproduction period, that's not just nesting. A lot more happens, as we all know, once young leave the nest. Right? There's a whole nother part of the life cycle that needs to be contended with before those individuals are capable of heading to South and Central America for the winter and then returning the next year. And what we found when we actually placed transmitters on nestlings of cerulean warblers and nestlings of golden-winged warblers was that these species take their offspring to places that are very different from where they build a nest. And this has been shown for many other species. The golden-winged warbler takes its young to denser, more canopy-closed young forest stands. Cerulean warblers bring their kids out of those forests that have those gaps that are typically associated with nesting to more dense canopies. So providing these types of conditions across a local landscape is paramount. It is crucial to the full reproductive season success of these species. When we place this black dot in the middle of this timber harvest, this overstory removal that had a nesting golden-winged warbler, and we look at the radius on average of where adults would take their young over the first 30 days as those kids become what looks to be like an adult warbler and ready themselves for migration, you see that they're using a landscape quite a bit bigger than that harvest. And of course, cerulean warblers the same way. This would be the area in which a cerulean warbler would use if that black dot was a cerulean warbler nest. The problem is, and I recommend everyone to take a look at the Shifley et al. 2014 paper, 5 anthropogenic factors that will radically alter forest conditions and management needs in the northern United States. The problem, one of those problems, gets back at that landscape scale clearing that happened long before any of us on this webinar were around, but we are in fact paying for it now. They will uniformly grow old without management intervention. You can see on this graph that the vast majority of our forests are of very middle-aged condition. These are not old. 80-year-old forest is not an old forest. We want to have more of those younger forest acres on the landscape, and we certainly want this graph to be able to extend well beyond the ending point of about 110 years that this graph shows. That should have a very long tail on this graph. And it's going to take time for much of our forests to get there. But all of those stressors, all of those pressures, and all of those unknown factors that will be affecting our forests, that are affecting our forests, is something that we're going to have to deal with in allowing those forests to get to those older age classes, and also to increase responsibly the young forests that we need on the landscape as well. And we could always take the approach of, oh, we're just going to let our forests grow old and that'll be great. Things will do well. You can have that approach, but I ask you to look at this graph. Cerulean warbler population declines over the last 40 years, 50 years. You think the cerulean warbler has another 50 years for our forests to grow older? Do you think the golden wing warbler has another 50 years for our forests to grow older and create gap dynamics that the species might use to nest in? I would argue that they do not. In combination, the science derived from evidence from population trends and species habitat relationships demonstrate quite convincingly that conserving and recovering these species and many others will require stewardship. And luckily, we have foresters like Amanda on our side, and they look at the forest not from a bird perspective, but from a forest perspective. And they use well-grounded forest management techniques to make decisions in a sustainable forestry framework that provides for the diverse conditions that so many bird species and other taxa need. They know how to take a forest, provide young forest, responsibly regenerate it, and allow that forest to be on a trajectory to being an old forest again. And they know how to make old forests stay old forest in the best of their powers, given the many stressors, and do the stewardship activities that are less active or intense, if you will, but still nonetheless very important. Stewardship is how we will improve interspersion of age classes, diversity of conditions. Remember, diversity begets diversity. And foresters, given a well-stocked toolbox, a plan, and time, can get us, and we should add money, lots of money. This is not a money-making endeavor on many of these acres. Stewardship costs. Stewardship is the equivalent of keeping your house well-maintained, and that costs money. And that is often one of the biggest factors limiting the stewardship across both public and private lands. But stewardship can result in wonderful outcomes, whether it be this young forest stand polluted with oak regeneration, or this older forest that has just had some tinkering done through prescribed fire and some low shade removal of interfering species that has now made this older forest resilient to climate change, more resilient to the next gypsy moth outbreak that kills the parent oaks. This stand will likely become an oak stand if gypsy moth comes through and kills the parent trees. So here is our forest bird conservation canvas, if you will. And we can divide that, if we're just gonna think about New Jersey, we can divide that into private and public forests. Private forests play a critical role. Almost 50% of New Jersey's forests privately owned, the other half publicly, federal or state agency owned.
I'm giving you the 1 minute warning.
Yep. It's hard to do the work that we need to do on small lands. So we'll think about the opportunities on public lands. And public land opportunities are greater from a dynamic forest perspective because of their larger acreages. And we're lucky that we have funders like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through funding with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to create dynamic forest restoration blocks in counties just across the river in Pennsylvania. All of these plans, it starts with a plan. It has to start with a plan. Don't even start forest management if you don't have a plan. Plans are based on data collected at all of those red dots in this image. And I want you to look at this particular screen. We talk about the importance of oaks and keeping oak on the landscape. Look at this. This here is the percent of our canopy trees for oak species, 63% of the basal area accounted for by those 4 oak species. Here's the suppressed understory. Should these mature oaks die from a disease, what are you going to get as your next forest? 57% red maple and sweet birch in the understory. Oak is reduced by 31%. Your plan has to have a well-articulated idea of where you want to go. Where do you want to be in 15 years? And notice, age classes will advance. And in this particular plan, 92% of the forest is advancing into the older age classes. And the forest is still so young that it's not getting to the 125 yet. We also do bird monitoring in these places so that we have baseline population trends for which we can then use to compare with data collected later after the forest has had a chance to be managed, stewarded, use the term you'd like. So I'll end with the signs of success can be a wonderfully diverse, regenerating young forest, a wonderfully resilient older forest that you see here, species rich, represented by all of the species that require diverse age classes. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. My email is here. I'm happy to take questions in this session, or if you have one that you'd like to send me via email. I'm glad to help further promote the conversation of forest stewardship.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you, Doug. And thank you, Amanda. We have left some time for questions. We have lots of questions in the Q&A. We may go a little bit over on the Q&A because I'd like to get to them, but understand that this is being recorded so that if you have to leave the webinar, I will send out the link to the recording to everyone, and then you can fast forward and get any questions that perhaps you might have missed. So I'm going to turn it over to Drew now to go through the Q&A. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks. So the first question that I got in the chat, and this maybe is for everybody if you just want to give a really short answer to it, is why is complexity and diversity necessary in our forest? Why is that part of a healthy forest, as part of the definition of a healthy forest? I don't know who wants to take it first.
I'll jump in quickly. Complexity and diversity creates different niches. And that's how you pack species into a forest. And the stability and productivity of any ecosystem increases as you increase the number of species. So species-rich ecosystems are far more stable, far more productive. So we want diverse ecosystems in terms of the number of niches, and that'll give us the number of species to keep things stable.
Jeff or Amanda, anything to add, or is that?
Can't say it better than that, but Doug, your camera's off. We can't see you.
Ah.
Perfectly stated.
Excellent. All right. This next question is specifically for either Doug or Jeff. Can you speak about the importance of white oak species regarding diversity of insects and wildlife, and how best to manage them alongside oaks?
Very quickly, I just had a student finish a comparison of 16 species of oaks in terms of the amount of insect. You know, we measured insect use by measuring holes in leaves, but more insects were using white oak than any other species, not by a lot. So all the oaks are good. White oak was a little bit better. You know, I would worry more about choosing an oak that is right for your spot, the right soil type, the right altitude and amount of moisture, than I would worry about whether it's going to support insects. They all support a lot of insects.
Looks like Jeff's agreeing. So next question then is, can anybody on the panel talk a little bit about soil health and the understory habitat in relationship to stewardship practices, including any mechanical removal, et cetera? Can you talk about the soil health relationship there?
I can start with that, especially from the timber harvesting perspective. So I'll say, first of all, soil stability is a central consideration in any timber harvest. Timber harvests really need to follow best management practices, or BMPs, which are designed to protect water quality. And they really do that by retaining soil stability. So one way to do that, harvest roads can be laid out in a way to minimize soil surface impacts. Although having said that, there are some tree species that actually respond well to scarification, to honestly driving that equipment or driving ATVs, or even better, sometimes prescribed fire if it's the right species and setting, to scarify the soil so that those acorns or pine cones, depending on your species, that are adapted to settling in soil as opposed to in duff or in other stuff on top, can really take root and take off. So sometimes that scarification is important. But I will say that soil structure has really changed a lot with the changing climate. The drought that we experience periodically, the hotter heat, if there's more asphalt around, just more just in the microclimates, can be really it can really change the soil structure. And then when you get heavier rains, then the water doesn't seep in naturally like a sponge. It really just it creates erosion, it creates runoff, it creates problems because the soil isn't functioning the way it should. So that's not to say that's everywhere, but again, soil stability is a central consideration in a timber harvest, and climate change is one of the factors that makes it a little harder to manage.
I would also add that some of the stewardship activities that, particularly what we would call non-commercial activities, such as like a mid-story reduction, something that would allow a little bit of sunlight to get to the forest floor. A low shade removal would be another way you would phrase that. In some cases, a chop and drop is a technique used. It's non-commercial. The value of the forest there, and the way it's been hydrated repeatedly over decades and decades. The only option you really have is to restart succession and restart that forest and tend that acreage as it advances through the next bit of succession. All of that leaves down woody material in immense numbers across the forest floor, which of course provides great microhabitats for all sorts of organisms, as well as adds to that soil base as it breaks down.
Great. Question for Jeff, super quickly. Can you just explain the mechanism? You showed the fern herbicide then regenerating into oak seedlings. Can you just explain the mechanism through how that happens?
Sure. So forester would identify this area as being covered with hay-scented fern, very little opportunities for any kind of tree seedling regeneration of any sort, really. And in this case, if making sure this forest is resilient and is on trajectory to be replaced by an oak forest, whether it be through a commercial harvest, shelterwood sequence, let's say, or some non-commercial late successional stewardship activity, The first thing that you need to do in any of this work is control for competing vegetation as well as mitigate deer impacts, right? So in this case, you have to just take into account that deer are in some way being dealt with here. So the fern is the next step in which we have to deal with. So in this case, before you put any light on the forest floor, you would actually spray with herbicide the fern. It would die. You would then get the soil conditions, right? The forest floor conditions that would be that would allow for oaks to germinate and to become young seedlings, or whatever species that you're interested in managing here. I'm typically working in oak silviculture. And then what you might do is, of course, open up a little bit of that mid-story, do what we call a low shade removal or some kind of a thinning from below, which would allow just enough light to get in there for those. Next time that oak acorn crop drops, the conditions are ready. They're going to be able to get the sunlight that they need to do what they need to do to germinate and enter into that competitive stage of life.
Great. Can anybody on the panel, this is for everybody, can you talk about the idea, you talked about fragmentation and all of that being an issue. Can you explain why some of forest stewardship practices creating younger forests, anything isn't fragmenting, but is actually keeping the forest contiguous or healthier?
Because young forest is in fact forest. That's what it is. It's young forest. It takes some more tending in those early years after it's been created, because you can't this day and age think that you can manage for young forest and walk away from that forest. You have to repeatedly walk into that young forest that you've created, and you have to make sure that things are going the way they should be going. Right there, it doesn't stop just at the removal of big trees, and of course, legacy trees within young forest that are recently created, green tree retention. You use the term you'd like to use. When that young forest continues and it advances out of that stand initiation and into stem exclusion and the regenerating vegetation, those saplings get a little bit taller. Close your eyes and imagine those big legacy trees providing this super canopy with this next level of forest generation coming into the stand. It's ephemeral. We've been doing work for golden wing warbler for since 2012 on working lands, and I just finished the field season on many of those properties, and I'm just amazed every time I go in there to see how ephemeral those young forest conditions are. Things that were brambles and goldenrod and asters, all of those things that Doug mentioned were important in the mid-Atlantic, they're gone now. It's leaf litter and young trees. So where we have that on the landscape needs to be placed back, in proportion, and understand that that is not fragmentation. Roads, shopping centers, power line corridors, things that make something not forest, that are more linear and smaller in scale, that's fragmentation.
Yeah, I'll add that, that as we keep emphasizing, there's the whole time scale perspective that's really, really critical here. Yes, when you see an immediate timber harvest, it looks disruptive. It sure looks different right after it happens. But the point isn't the immediate look. The point is, how is it going to set it on the right trajectory over time? So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what forest birds, what other species of wildlife, what insects, what caterpillars are going to be taking advantage of that? So it's really a matter of thinking about it over the long term, not just what you're seeing immediately, and also across the landscape as well, because there is so much fragmentation across New Jersey's landscape that where you are able to manage, to steward, to treat forest acres, you're doing that where you can, when you can, and over time, ideally, you get to support and steward and enhance the forest conditions wherever it's possible. But it doesn't all happen at once. It takes time. And it takes having that landscape perspective and the long-term perspective as well.
So hopefully, panelists, you can stick around for a couple more minutes. We are a little bit over time. And so I did just want to thank everyone who was attending. If you have to jump off, we totally understand this world. We're probably in back-to-back meetings. But since our panelists looks like they can stick around, I will ask a couple more questions. The next one, I'm going to roll a few questions into one because it all focuses basically on deer. And so this is for anybody, but how basically, what would you suggest for how we manage deer? There was a suggestion or a question about what role potentially hunters and trappers play. Is predator introduction? There's a lot of stuff in here, increased human hunting, et cetera. So just what would you guys suggest, or what are good policies for how we can manage deer better?
I'll just say briefly that it is a challenge in a landscape with a lot of people. New Jersey is the most densely populated state, and people are part of that ecosystem too. So if natural predator introduction and hunting, those things need to take into account local communities and people that are affected. It needs to be, whatever practices you use need to be safe for the people that are there. I would definitely defer to New Jersey DEP on what are the best ways to manage deer in that landscape.
I'd also point out that about maybe I'm going to say maybe a month and a half ago, I think there was a 3-day, like almost all day webinar on managing deer in eastern forests workshop. So it's a complicated topic with many experts and many opinions. And the practices can be keeping deer out of particular places through deer exclusion fencing. It's expensive, but it certainly works. But then I would argue also that excluding deer from a forest 100% is also not natural in the development of what a forest should be. So I have to think about the role that deer in moderate, appropriate numbers, in what we shouldn't probably use the word overabundant deer. We should just say deer out of balance with the local landscape. Because 2 deer in a 100-acre forest with a ½ acre of young forest is too many deer.
I will quickly add, people say, well, let's introduce predators. That'd be great, but we know the challenges here. But there is a predator that's introducing itself. It's a fairly minor one with deer, but I'm talking about coyotes, and we still have open season on coyotes. Shoot them anytime you want because I don't know why, but they will take fawns for a little while, and it's the only natural, quote, natural control that we have. I'm speaking from experience. I found a fawn leg in my driveway the other day. So, somebody was helping me out there. But every year we add more fawns than are taken by predators. But it's silly to be shooting the ones that are trying to help at this point.
I'll nerd out later with Jeff and Doug, but the Cornell Slash Wall Resource Center, a slash wall is another way of using brush from a timber harvest to create kind of a natural wall around an opening where you want to protect regeneration for a while, and then within a matter of years, that brush from the trees will degrade over time and decompose. So it keeps the deer out for long enough that the regeneration can be established. I'll send you a link later.
Great. So I have a question. I think this speaks to, and again, maybe we can give really quick examples about what type of management. I know you guys haven't necessarily looked at everything, but what type of management policies would help increase and accelerate creating diversity in different parts of the state? So specifically northern part of the state versus the southern part of the state. What, to your best knowledge, I know none of you have potentially studied all of New Jersey, but maybe just quick examples of what would be kind of 2 different policies there, or how that would work out.
Policies. Well, I would say 2 things come to mind. One is to allow foresters those educated very well on this subject. To have to their availability all the tools in the toolbox to be able to do their jobs. And, you know, it's a forester as a profession should be treated no different than an auto mechanic, a carpenter, or any other profession that utilizes a diverse bunch of tools, a surgeon that utilizes a bunch of tools to accomplish a job, and to not have those tools available does not result often in an outcome that you want, right? Having policies in place that empower foresters to be able to do the planning and the implementation of the activities that need to happen is important. And the other is policy that provides more funding to do the work that forests need to have done. And that's probably the most significant. That gets capacity on the ground, and of course the equipment and the tools that are necessary to do the work. It's expensive. I would estimate, I mean, I'm just going to throw it out there on my own experience, but I'm going to say proper stewardship of an average acre of forest is probably somewhere around $600. Certainly $450 to $600. It's expensive, and we need to have that available to us. The value of forests on our landscape, whether it be for biodiversity or human recreation or whatever your choice might be, whatever your pleasure might be, is too great to not have the funding applied to doing the work that needs to be done.
I just briefly add, you know, policies, land use policies, it would minimize irreversible fragmentation would be very helpful too.
I agree.
Great.
And that some of that funding for implementation is, of course, recovering forests on land.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. This is a very technical question. I'm not sure if anybody will have the answer to, but I'm sure there is an answer, just because it speaks directly to New Jersey. The question, I'm going to read it exactly as it is. Since all forests are of different ecological value, RTE, species, habitat, age diversity, et cetera, what is the definition of forest used to reach the 42%/2 million acres in New Jersey? So how did they define forest, I think is the question, which I don't know if anybody knows the answer, if that's a DEP question.
That is a U.S. Forest Service forest inventory assessment question. I can find that website and send that along to you, Drew, if you wanted to share that with whoever wanted to have that information.
Yeah, just briefly, the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program takes plots across the U.S. And they track land cover change, among other things. So there's different ways to get at those data, and breaking down within that forest what species are most common, what is the quality of that forest. But yeah, FIA is the most common way to get to some of that. Now with all the aerial imagery, there's more land cover data and other ways, but that's probably the most scientifically sound way.
Great. So this question, so they specifically say for private landowners, but I think this could also apply potentially to other areas. Are there biodiversity benefits to leaving isolated standing dead trees, or have invasive species increased the frequency of standing dead trees to the point where they're no longer quote unquote necessary?
I would say, snags are extremely important. There are what, 75, 80, 82 species of birds in the US that are tree hole nesters. Where do they get the tree holes? Snags are really important that way. That's just breeding birds. There's a whole community of insects that take advantage of decaying trees. So it's part of a natural forest, and leave them if you can.
And the bigger the better for snags. The bigger they are, the more benefits they have to birds and other species of wildlife.
Yeah, and particularly in areas where you've actually opened up the canopy a little bit, it's very valuable species like bats that would have use those as maternity sites, and that solar radiation warms that and is something that they seek out. So cannot be overstated the importance of standing dead trees, AKA snags, for sure.
Great. And then final question, can anybody, especially I think this is probably for either Amanda or Jeff, just clarify the definition here, I think one last time of forest stewardship and management plans as opposed to commercial logging, and examples kind of both and what you might see in some of them, for anybody who's wondering what the difference between those two are and any confusion that might be out there.
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Either way, I'm sure we're both going to say something here. So, forest stewardship, again, getting back to all the tools in the toolbox, in a desire to increase H-class diversity across our lands, as well as structural complexity within the forest. That toolbox has two broad categories of tools: commercial and non-commercial. And all of that should be available. And in many cases, it's going to take a little bit of commercial to generate some funds that might pay for those non-commercial practices that are very, very expensive. If it's done right, and this is a shout out to private landowners, really. Take those funds that you are able to get from any kind of a commercial aspect, put it back into your stewardship. Put it back into the new roof on the house, right? Put it back into some new layer of paint. Make sure that things are solid in the rest of your forest. Make sure that you put aside a little bit of that money to go back into that area that was treated with some commercial, and treat that invasive species that might start to creep in. Those are your responsibilities that when you are a responsible steward of your forest that you would do. Stewardship is all of that. It's not one or the other.
I would emphasize, the aspect of a plan. Having a plan. If you're a private landowner, or if you're a public landowner, a forest management plan captures your objectives. What are your goals for your land? But it's not enough to just say what your goals are and what you want it to, what you want it to be to you in the future or in the present. You need to talk about how you're going to get there. And it needs to be realistic, and it needs to take into account not just what is there currently, but what factors are affecting it, what species are vulnerable, what tree species are vulnerable, what wildlife species are vulnerable, if that's part of your, part of your objectives. And how do you factor all of those things? And then you develop the prescription, or your forester will work with you to develop the prescription for those stands that will help you achieve your goals. So a plan really involves looking at the whole, figuring out what's there, what the challenges are, what your tools are that can help you get there. And the planning part, the prescription, is how you will actually get there. All of that goes into a plan.
I'll just quickly say managing, the way I opened my talk, managing for board feet is very different from managing for diversity. So you can get some board feet when you manage for diversity, but in the long-term managing for board feet, you're picking particular tree species, you're getting rid of the old guys because they're going to slow the growth of the other ones, and so on. So a board foot managed forest looks very different from one that's managed for diversity.
All right, I thank all of our participants. And Eileen, I actually want to turn I said that was the final question, but really the final question is to you, because I got it a few times, is where can people access the recording of this, when will it be available, et cetera, because we have been recording it. So I'll turn that true final question over to you.
Yeah, this was recorded. I will have the link to the recording once it's over, and it'll be everyone who registered will get that link. So it'll go automatically from Zoom to you. So yay. With that, there were still lots of really good questions that we did not get to, but I will tell those who asked those questions that these can inform our future webinars. We do have at least 2 more webinars scheduled on the topic. So thank you for asking these very thoughtful questions and making very thoughtful statements, because they will help us as we plan our next webinars. Thank you so much to Amanda and Doug and Jeff. We really appreciate having your time here today. And with that, though, and thank you to those who were able to stay. We went 15 minutes over. But I hope to see you all again on August 4th and after that. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Zoom, goodbye.
Bye.